Excellent. Thanks for that kind introduction. It's great to be here with you all today, or kind of be here with you all today. But I'm excited to share our work on NABs with you. So today I'm going to talk about the results of these three manuscripts. And these manuscripts were the result of a collaboration between UC Davis and the VLB. Now, given the time restrictions today, I'm going to primarily talk about the results and not the methodology. So if you have any questions about the methodologies, I would just refer directly to the manuscripts. So on to the first manuscript. And the main goal of this work was to investigate if there were chemical or sensory attributes that were related to Northern California consumer preference towards non-alcoholic beer, or NAB. So this manuscript was split into three parts. You can see that here. The first was to use sensory analysis to see how much the NABs that were already being commercially produced varied in 2019 on the global market. Then we used consumer analysis to evaluate the preferences of American consumers towards the most diverse NABs. And then finally, we chemically deconstructed the NABs to see if any chemical factors could be related to American consumer preference. So for this study, we obtained 42 different NABs from 6 different countries. You can see those in the chart here, or in the table. And we were, of these NABs, you can see they come from a wide variety of different styles. I also want to point out that we evaluated 2 controls, a commercial seltzer and a commercial soda, and we'll get into why that's important in the second study. So here are the sensory terms that the panelists came up with to describe the samples. The aroma terms are in here in red, and the taste and mouthfeel are here in green. Just some pictures of the testing environment for sensory. Here you can see that sensory was performed in light isolating booths under red light, and the judges tasted the samples over 3 replications and a randomized order. To analyze the sensory data, we performed 3-way ANOVA on the DA, or descriptive analysis data, and to process the replicated data, we use, or replicated kata data, we use Cochrane's Q-test on each replication. And what's most important is that for all the terms, we saw significant differences between, or at least for one of the samples. Now, to view the sensory, the results of the sensory analysis, what we did was perform principal component analysis. And what we see is that generally the principal component analysis could be split into 4 general quadrants. The lagers and wheats here on this bottom right were the most malty, stale, thin, and bitter, while the lagers towards this top right were more fruity in character and had aromas like apple and banana. While if we now go over and look at the bottom left, those are IPAs that are more herbal, grassy, bitter, and drying, where the IPAs towards that top left, or Radlers, were more tropical and citrusy in flavor. While it's clear that lager types here on the right side, you can see there's just a lot more NABs on that side, make up a majority of the NABs that were being produced in 2019. What's clear from the results is that NABs can be and were being designed to have a variety of flavor profiles. We then used those results to select 12 NABs with the most diverse flavor profiles and took those into consumer analysis. And I've highlighted those in the light blue here. So that leads us into our second question: what were the flavors Northern California consumers were most or least satisfied with in non-alcoholic beer? And to do this, we recruited 129 consumers, split almost in half by gender. And you can see from the results of our demographic survey here that they were young, educated beer drinkers. So let's dive into the data again. And again, we used an analysis of variance, or ANOVA, as well as mean comparisons to see if there were significant differences in the way the consumers were rating the overall liking, the aroma liking, or the taste and mouthfeel liking. And the most preferred samples are down there at the bottom. We can see Hopwater 2, Radler 1, and Lager 16 were the most preferred, and the least preferred were at the top here, IPA 3 or Pale Ale 1. Now, to explore the drivers of consumer preference, we used external preference mapping. And doing this, the consumer satisfaction can be shown as a contour plot. And really what the takeaway here is that the areas in orange are areas of high consumer preference or satisfaction, and areas in blue are low areas of low consumer satisfaction. And what we see if we go back to the PCA now in the 4 quadrants, the lagers and wheats, which were more malty, skunky, and stale and bitter, were the least preferred by consumers, while the lagers and wheats that were more fruity in character, had those apple and banana characteristics, were more preferred by consumers. And then going now over into the top left, we see that the most preferred products were the Radlers, IPAs, and hop waters that had tropical or citrus characters. But there were IPAs down here in this bottom left that were more herbal, grassy, solvent, bitter, and drying that were least preferred by consumers. So this data just suggests that there are general flavor profiles that Northern California consumers are preferring or not preferring. And that leads us into the final question: were there chemical constituents leading to the most or least preferred flavors? And to do this, we used a host of non-volatile methods to break down the composition of the different NABs. I'm not going to go into that. You can refer to the manuscript on those details. And here we see a couple of general stories. The first is that the least preferred NABs were characterized by malty-stale aromas, which were associated to increases in staling aldehydes, such as trans-2-nonanol, while increases in fermentation esters seem to be associated with the more preferable fruity NABs. The next story is that terpenes, esters, and alphatic straight-chain aldehydes were associated with the aroma profiles of the highly preferred citrusy, hoppy, and NABs, such as Radler 1, which was blended with citrus juice like lemon, or the dry hop products Hopwater 2 and IPA 1. And what's interesting is that these volatiles were also significantly negatively correlated with malty, stale aromas, and that might indicate that the volatiles suppress those aromas. However, there were some IPAs over here at the top that were more herbal in characteristics, and these were related to increases in hexanol, pentanol, and dimethyl sulfide. Now, due to past research, what we thought is that this could be related to dry hopping practice, and specifically how much material was added during dry hopping. And so humulinones are oxidized alpha acids. They're present in hops. And what you see from this relationship is that as you add more material into beer, going from left to right, you increase the amount of humulinones, and it's a linear relationship. So more hops into beer, more humulinones. And what you can do is then take that linear relationship, and what we did was measure the humulinone content in the NABs, and then estimated based upon that relationship the dry hopping amount. And what you can see here is that going from 0 up to 1,200 gram per hectoliter, what we see is that you sort of get a peak here between 600 and 800. And then it starts to fall off past 800 in terms of consumer liking and the train panel liking. And that might indicate that above 800 gram per hectoliter, you're getting an extraction of some characteristics that might be driving the herbal tea flavors, such as hexanol, pentanol, dimethyl sulfide. Whereas in that range of 600 to 800, you might be getting a more preferential extraction of desired volatiles. And just to note that 48% of the NABs contain humulinones, which indicates that a majority of samples were being dry hopped. Pretty interesting. Again, there were also clear relationships with the analytical factors driving the differences between taste and mouthfeel as well. For example, if we go towards that top blue area, consumers were least satisfied with NABs that had high bitterness, which was correlated to high BUs and high isoalpha content. And you can see that the samples in the over here in the orange area, those were NABs that were increasing in sweetness, and that was related to high residual extract. And the NABs down here, which were also highly preferred, were fizzier and more tingling, and that was due to higher CO2 concentrations. So let's move on to the next manuscript. In this manuscript is a little bit heady, Because what we were trying to see is if there were flavors or chemical factors which allowed NABs to be perceived as more beer-like. And essentially the question was, what do you need to put in an NAB to make sure it seems or tastes like beer? And we were interested in exploring this because with non-alcoholic beer, you're designing a product to invoke the characteristics of beer, but it's not beer, and we all know that. And there are many different definitions to what beer is. And for example, the Brewers Association in the US has defined over 100 plus different styles of beer. Therefore, it becomes more and more difficult to come up with a general term for what beer is. And from a flavor perspective, I think we would all agree that a Berliner Weisse is not a chocolate stout. However, because lager styles have been the king of beer production for the last couple of decades, I think when we all discuss beer flavor, it's in reference to lager beer styles. But we also wanted to see if this was true for consumers, because it would have implications on how NAB should be marketed. Therefore, along with the past study and those samples, what we did is asked the consumers in the trained panel these additional questions. And what we wanted them to do was rate how closely they thought the NABs were to beer, soda, and sparkling flavored water. Briefly, here's that data process, and what I just want to point out again, this is processed via analysis of variance and the mean comparisons, and what we saw is that the trained panel and the consumer panel saw significant differences in how closely they thought the NABs resembled beer, soda, and sparkling flavored water. So again, we performed external preference mapping and principal component analysis, but this time we added in these similarity ratings. And this allowed us to see if the resemblance of beer, sparkling flavored water, or soda was related to consumer preference for NABs. Again, the area in orange is an area of high satisfaction for consumers, and the area in blue is an area of low satisfaction for consumers. The aromas related to beer likeness were malty, dried yeast, and skunk, and the volatiles related to beer flavor were 3-methyl-1-butanol and dimethyl sulfide. These results are not that surprising because we all know fermentation is not just important for developing alcohol. A significant amount of the flavor of beer results from the secondary products that are also produced during fermentation, such as higher alcohol or esters. But it does highlight the importance of utilizing fermentation to produce beer-like NABs. Now, to produce more complex beer-like NABs or fruitier NABs, a couple of strategies have been suggested. One technique that is gaining popularity is the use of non-Saccharomyces yeast, and there's also evidence in these manuscripts that these yeasts lead to increases in fermentation esters or alcohols that create NABs with fruitier profiles. Another technique is to simply blend in a percentage of fully fermented beer with the dealcoholized product to the legally allowable regulatory limit. And again, these papers are great resources on these two topics. Another really interesting finding was that skunky character was related to an increase in beer likeness. As most of us should know, this is a characteristic that is related to both hop and packaging. It occurs when the sidearm of isoalpha acid is cleaved by a reactive oxygen species that's produced when UV light can get through clear and green bottles. And this causes a cascade which produces skunky thiol. Now, NABs that were perceived more soda-like had more citrusy stone fruit aromas, and this was driven by increases in terpenes, esters, and alphatic straight chain aldehydes. And what we can see is that the soda control sits in this space. Therefore, NABs such as Hopwater 1 or IPA 1, which had more fruity hop aromas, were perceived as more soda-like. And again, were the most preferred by consumers. They're sitting in that orange region. And this is extremely interesting to me because what it may mean is that IPAs are the sodification of beer. And what I mean by that is that the flavor profiles of popular sodas are driven by the same volatiles. These volatiles are being increasingly put into IPAs via dry hopping or with hop oils to create beers with these more citrusy tropical aromas. And also we're trying to push down sensorial bitterness in these products. I also think this is kind of interesting because it might point out that NABs are not necessarily cannibalizing beer drinkers away from the beer market, but they could be also taking away market share from the soft drink industry, and I think that's really interesting. Now, from a non-volatile and taste perspective, what we see is that NABs that had high sensorial bitterness, which was related to increases in BU and isoalpha acid, were perceived to be more beer-like. And you can see that in the blue region going towards the top of the PCA. And this shouldn't be too much of a surprise because the chemicals driving hop bitterness are really only found in beer. Also notable is that NABs with higher alcohol concentrations were perceived to be more beer-like. And so that's a really interesting finding that agrees with some of the findings that I just talked about. Not surprisingly, the most sweet NABs with the higher residual extracts were perceived to be more soda-like. And you can see that, again, the soda control sits in that space. And the attributes related to more sparkling water were more tingling, fizzy, which was driven by high CO2 concentrations. And you can see that seltzer, commercial seltzer, sits in that space. So in summary, I think what this work really shows is that there are characteristics which result in consumers to perceive these products as more like beer, soda, or sparkling flavored water. And I think it's really important to consider that these factors are having an influence on consumer preference. Also, these factors should be considered in how NABs are marketed because it's clear that consumers have a predetermined opinion of what beer is. And these mostly overlap with lager beer characteristics. For example, then, if you were to design a non-alcoholic Berliner Weisse, you might want to consider if you're marketing that product as a beer in the US. So let's dive into the final manuscript. And Niels has already talked about this a bit later, but we're going to talk about it from another lens. In the past manuscripts, we had very limited details with how the NABs were made. Therefore, in this study, we work with German Pilsner-style NABs again to investigate the influence of production technique specifically on NAB flavor. In total, 19 Pilsner-type NABs and 1 non-alcoholic IPA from 18 breweries were selected for analysis. And 4 of these were labeled as alcohol-free beers. And overall, we had a pretty good idea of how these beers were made because of either personal communication with the breweries or some online sleuthing. But you can see that the NABs are comprised of a range of different production techniques. So similar to the past studies, we deconstructed the chemical and sensorial profiles of the NABs and then compared those using multivariate statistics. And today I'm just going to focus on the multiple factor analysis. So let's dive right into the data. What we see here is the observation chart from the multiple factor analysis and all the different NABs within that space. And this analysis is similar to principal component analysis in that samples that are close in this space generally have similar characteristics. And the MFA was built with the sensorial and chemical results. Here you can see, I want to point out that the IPA reference sits at that top right corner. What we see is that production technique had a significant impact on the chemical and sensorial profile of the different NABs. You can see that the physically dealkalized products sit over there on the left. The vacuum distilled products, or most of them, are in yellow, and the physically dealkalized product is in blue, while the restricted fermentation samples sit down here in purple, and the maltose intolerant strains are in red. And the combined treatments are in that green, or most of them sit in that green space. So not surprisingly, it's obvious the group with the most variation is NABs produced through combined treatments. Now, it's not clear from the observation chart what is driving those differences, so we have to use the correlation circle to probe what sensory or chemical profiles are driving those differences. And what we see is that NABs down in that bottom right that were produced with restricted fermentation were the most wordy, sweet, thick, and had the longest aftertaste. Analytically, they had the highest pHs, the highest residual extracts, and the highest concentrations of dextrins, such as maltose, as well as the highest concentrations of some volatiles, such as nonanol and decanol. Now, past work at the VLB has shown that the concentrations of these volatiles tend to be low in fully fermented beer, but in wort, their concentrations are at a detectable level. And I don't think this is surprising because these NABs are essentially wort, minimal fermentation. In comparison, the physically dealkalized NABs on the left were the most sour. They had the lowest taste and aroma intensities and were the least harmonious. And these NABs also had the lowest concentrations of fermentable carbohydrates, as well as the lowest pHs. And finally, the NABs up towards that top right were the maltose intolerant, those produced with maltose intolerant yeast, as well as those that were dry hopped. And they had the highest hop aroma, the highest aroma and taste intensities, and were the most harmonious. And this was particularly highlighted by the inclusion of that reference IPA that I pointed out. Notably, these NABs also had the highest ABVs, which I'll talk a little bit about, and the highest concentrations of terpene alcohols, esters, and alphatic straight-chain aldehydes. And this finding agrees with a lot of previous work, the previous two studies I talked about, but a lot of previous work by other authors as well that has shown that dry hopping or hop oil additions can serve as a practical way to mask the negative aroma attributes that are commonly associated with NAB, or just make the aroma of NAB more complex. Now, as I was kind of getting to, ABV concentration is a critical consideration in the design of NABs. And so here you can see the ABVs of the different NABs reported. And similar to the previous studies, as the NABs, as the ABV of the NABs increased, that's going towards that top right corner, the NABs were becoming more harmonious. And this is particularly highlighted if we look at two combined treatments, C2 and C6. So both of these treatments are produced from the same brewery, and they represent a dealkalized stream blended with a restricted fermentation in the case of C2, which is a 0-0, and in the case of C6, that's a dealkalized stream blended with a full-strength beer. Now, although 0.0 or alcohol-free beers are marketed for specific reasons, this does show that the addition of full-strength beer up to the legally allowable regulatory limit does make NABs more harmonious. Interestingly, two combined products not labeled as 0.0 beers were relatively low in ABV, and that's C7 and C3. And it remains unclear why the brewers of these NABs did not take advantage of a legally justifiable ABV margin, because it's clear that just simply blending in full-strength beer to these samples might make them more harmonious. Similarly, the RF or restrictive fermentation NABs down here could be blended with full-strength beer if they're not marketed as alcohol-free to make their profiles more harmonious. Now, one notable exception is the vacuum distilled treatment here, V2. It had a chemical and flavor profile that was more similar to the restricted fermentation products, and one possible route to obtain this NAB would have been the utilization of a special mashing regime that would have limited the formation of fermentable sugars. And this highlights that initial wort construction is also an important and critical consideration in the development of NAB flavor. So the overall takeaway from this work is that developing NABs, I think, is with preferable flavors is pretty complex. So at first glance, it was much like the train system when I arrived in Berlin. But once you start to understand your roots, it's not that difficult to navigate. Obviously, the choices that a brewer makes to produce NAB will have a direct influence on the resulting flavor profile. So physically dealkalized NABs are going to be low in taste and aroma. And this could be a good thing, because essentially that could be a blank canvas that you're going to then use other techniques to get a desired NAB profile. While NABs produced with just restricted fermentation or limited fermentations are going to be sweet and wordy. But it's also clear by applying a combination of techniques, you're going to produce more harmonious NABs with, I guess, more complex flavors. And particularly the addition of hops seems to play really well if the style of NAB that you're trying to produce allows for that. But overall, I think what this suggests is that there's not a one-size-fits-all solution for every brewery in terms of producing great NABs. And with that, I'd just like to thank the organizing committee for this opportunity to share this work with you. I realize that I covered a lot of information, but the work, again, is published, so if you want to access anything, you're able to do that and look up additional information. And at this time, I would really like to thank the teams that made this work happen, the teams of Dr. Hildegard Heyman and Dr. Glenn Fox at the University of California, Davis, as well as the team of Dr. Niels Repberg here at the VLB. One final thanks, I would like to thank the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation for their support in funding my current fellowship at the VLB. And with that, I'd love to try and take any questions that you may have. Thank you.